Same laptop, same processor, same RAM, same storage, same screen, same keyboard, same everything you can actually touch and feel. One price tag says one number, the other says $140 less. The only difference sitting between those two prices is a single word on a drop-down menu, which operating system you want installed when the machine arrives. That's not a hypothetical. That's a real configuration option, sitting on the website of the single largest PC manufacturer on the planet right now that most people have simply never noticed. And once you actually see it laid out, it's hard to unsee. Think about the last time you bought a laptop, or the last time you helped a friend or family member pick one out. Did you ever click into the operating system selection and actually compare prices side by side? Almost nobody does. Windows just shows up as the assumed default, the box that's already checked, the option you'd have to actively go out of your way to change. That single small piece of consumer behavior, just not clicking one extra drop-down, is a big part of why this pricing gap sat quietly on Lenovo's own website for 6 years, before it became a story anyone was actually talking about. Let's start with who we're actually talking about, because the scale here matters enormously to understanding why this particular pricing gap is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as some obscure, irrelevant configuration quirk. Lenovo isn't some scrappy boutique PC builder catering to a niche audience of enthusiasts. Lenovo is the single largest PC manufacturer on the planet, commanding roughly a quarter of the entire global PC market. Bigger than HP, bigger than Dell, bigger than Apple's Mac lineup. When Lenovo makes a decision about how it prices and configures its products, that decision touches an enormous slice of the computers that regular people, businesses, schools, and governments actually buy every single day. To put that scale in perspective, we're talking about a company that ships tens of millions of PCs every single year across an enormous range of product lines. The ThinkPad business laptops that show up in offices worldwide, the ThinkStation workstations used by engineers and creative professionals, the consumer-facing Yoga and Legion lines, and more. This isn't a company operating on the margins of the industry, experimenting with something risky because it has little to lose. This is the company that, more than any other single manufacturer, defines what buying a PC actually looks like for hundreds of millions of people. So when a pricing decision like this shows up inside that catalog, it's not a fringe experiment. It's happening in full view of the company's absolute mainstream customer base. Now let's get to the actual numbers, because the numbers are the entire reason this story is worth 15 minutes of your time. Take the ThinkPad X1 Carbon, one of Lenovo's flagship business laptops, the kind of machine that ends up in the hands of executives and IT departments across the world on Lenovo's own US and Canadian websites. Choosing a Linux-based configuration over the identical Windows configuration knocks up to $140 off the price. In Canada, that discount runs even higher, up to 211 Canadian dollars. Same laptop, same silicon, same everything, right down to the screen and the keyboard. The only difference sitting between those two price tags is which operating system boots up when you turn it on. And this isn't limited to one model either. This option shows up across a meaningful chunk of Lenovo's lineup: ThinkPad, ThinkStation, and depending on the specific configuration, other lines as well. If you go to Lenovo's website directly and filter by operating system in their laptop section, you'll find this pricing structure sitting right there in plain sight, not buried in some special enterprise-only ordering system. Anyone can see it. Anyone can select it. Take a workstation class example that shows the pattern even more clearly. The ThinkPad P14s, a mobile workstation aimed at engineers and technical professionals, has shown up in deal tracking communities specifically because of how dramatically the price drops once you swap the operating system during the build your own configuration process. On Lenovo's customization tool, simply removing Windows 11 and selecting Ubuntu Linux instead has been documented to drop the price by roughly $159 on that particular configuration, on top of whatever other seasonal discounts or coupon codes happen to be active at the time. Stack that operating system savings with a promotional code, and buyers have reported total savings pushing up past $400 off the original list price on a single machine. That's not a marginal discount buried in fine print. That's a genuinely material difference for anyone comparing options before purchase. What's notable is that this isn't confined to entry-level or budget hardware either. These are legitimate, high-spec business and workstation machines, multi-core processors, upgradable memory, professional-grade displays, the same category of hardware that corporate IT departments and technical professionals are already buying in bulk. The Linux discount? Isn't Lenovo relegating open source to some stripped-down budget tier product line? It's sitting right there on the same premium hardware as the Windows version, which is part of what makes the price gap feel so directly comparable and so easy for a buyer to actually act on. So why does this pricing gap exist in the first place? This is where we get into what people in the industry have long, somewhat informally, called the Windows tax. Every single Windows laptop sold includes a Microsoft operating system license bundled directly into the hardware price. You never see this as its own separate line item at checkout the way you might see, say, an extended warranty or a software subscription. It's just folded invisibly into the total, but it's there, and industry estimates have long put that bundled licensing cost somewhere in the range of roughly $80 to $150 per machine, depending on the specific Windows edition and the manufacturer's licensing agreement with Microsoft. It's worth understanding a little about how these agreements actually work, because it explains why this cost has stayed so invisible for so long. Manufacturers like Lenovo negotiate bulk OEM licensing deals directly with Microsoft, and the specific terms of those deals, the per-unit pricing, the volume discounts, the exact conditions, are typically confidential business arrangements, not public information. That confidentiality is a big part of why, for decades, there was simply no way for an ordinary consumer to know exactly what portion of their laptop's price tag was Microsoft's cut versus the actual hardware cost. You paid one number for the whole machine, and that number was effectively a black box. For decades, that cost stayed essentially invisible to consumers because there was no real alternative sitting right next to it on the same product page for direct comparison. You couldn't easily see what a laptop would cost without Windows because virtually nobody was selling the exact same hardware both ways, side by side, with a visible price difference. Lenovo, whether by original design or simply as a byproduct of how they structured this configuration option, has now made that invisible cost invisible at genuine scale, sitting directly on the product page of one of the most popular business laptops on the market. And this is genuinely important to sit with for a second. This isn't a rounding error. $140 on a laptop is a meaningful number. For an individual buyer, that's real money. Enough to cover a year of streaming subscriptions, a decent pair of headphones, or a meaningful chunk toward an accessory you'd actually otherwise skip. For a business or a school district ordering hundreds or thousands of units for a hardware refresh, that gap multiplies into a genuinely significant line item in an IT budget, potentially tens of thousands of dollars in savings on a single large procurement order, just from choosing a different operating system at checkout. Now, here's a detail that I think genuinely surprised people when this got wider attention. Lenovo has actually been quietly doing this since at least 2020. This isn't some brand new 2026 initiative born out of a sudden ideological shift toward open source. It's been sitting there, mostly unnoticed by the mainstream press and even by a lot of everyday consumers, for roughly 6 years now. What changed recently isn't that Lenovo started doing this, it's that more people started actually noticing it, largely because a Reddit post about the pricing gap on that ThinkPad X1 Carbon started circulating widely. And from there, it made its way through the tech press, through outlets covering Linux and open source specifically, and eventually into wider tech discourse. Sometimes the biggest stories aren't about something new happening. They're about something that was already happening, finally getting the spotlight it probably should have had years earlier. It's worth asking why this took 6 years to become a mainstream story, because that delay is itself revealing. Part of it is simply that most people configuring a laptop online never bother clicking into the operating system filter options. They pick a model, maybe adjust the RAM or storage, and check out, never realizing there was a completely different price sitting one click away. Part of it is that Lenovo itself never marketed this pricing gap loudly. There was no banner ad or homepage call-out saying, save $140 by skipping Windows. You had to already know roughly where to look. And part of it, frankly, is that this kind of story needed the right cultural moment to actually land, a moment where Windows 10's end of support, Windows 11's hardware requirements, and growing frustration with Microsoft's direction had already primed a meaningfully larger audience to actually care about an alternative, rather than scrolling past it as a curiosity for hobbyists. That's really the story here in a nutshell. A 6-year-old pricing structure meeting a newly receptive audience, at exactly the moment several other pressures on Windows' default dominance were already stacking up. Let's talk about who actually benefits from this kind of pricing transparency. Because it's a wider audience than you might initially assume, developers and engineers who already prefer working in a Linux environment for their daily workflow get an obvious direct win. They were often going to wipe Windows and install Linux themselves anyway, so getting the machine cheaper from day one, with proper out-of-the-box hardware support for Linux already handled by Lenovo, is a straightforward improvement. That last part matters more than it might sound. Buying a machine with Linux support already validated by the manufacturer means avoiding the classic headaches of mismatched drivers, unsupported Wi-Fi chips, or fingerprint readers that never quite work right. Problems that have historically made Just install Linux yourself, a much bigger undertaking than it sounds for anyone without deep technical troubleshooting experience. But the more interesting audience is IT departments and business leaders who might never have previously questioned whether they actually needed to pay the Windows license on every single machine in a fleet. Cloud-first companies, businesses running most of their software through browser-based tools and web applications rather than locally installed Windows-specific software, increasingly don't have a hard technical requirement to run Windows specifically at all. For those organizations, this pricing gap turns what used to be an invisible, unquestioned cost into a genuine, visible decision point worth actually evaluating during a hardware refresh cycle. And once that evaluation happens even once, at even one company, word tends to spread through IT circles fairly quickly. A single procurement manager posting their savings numbers internally or in an industry forum can influence a lot of decisions well beyond their own organization. It's worth noting, too, that Lenovo isn't operating entirely alone in this space, even if it's by far the largest player doing it at this scale. Dell has offered Linux preloaded configurations on select developer-focused laptops for years. Smaller, Linux native manufacturers like System76 and Framework have built entire business models around exactly this kind of transparent, Linux-first pricing, though obviously at nowhere near Lenovo's overall volume or market reach. What makes Lenovo's version of this story different and genuinely more significant isn't that the concept itself is new. It's that Lenovo is doing it at the scale of the single largest PC manufacturer on Earth, on some of its most recognizable, most mainstream flagship products, not on some niche sideline most consumers have never heard of. It's also worth considering how this compares to the broader PC industry's usual approach to operating system choice. For most of the last 30 years, the standard playbook across virtually every major manufacturer has been to ship Windows as the default, and at most, offer a small number of enterprise-only no OS configurations, aimed specifically at large corporate customers who plan to image their own custom software onto the machines anyway. Consumer-facing configuration pages simply didn't offer a visible, priced Linux alternative sitting right next to the Windows option for an ordinary shopper to stumble across. Lenovo quietly breaking from that playbook, even if only on a subset of its lineup, represents a real departure from 3 decades of industry-standard practice, one that other manufacturers may or may not choose to follow, depending on how much attention and consumer interest this specific story continues to generate. Now, let's actually walk through what you'd be giving up and what you'd be gaining if you actually decided to take Lenovo up on this and skip Windows for one of these machines. Because $140 only matters if the trade-off underneath it actually makes sense for how you use a computer day to day, week to week, and not just at the moment of checkout when the savings feel most obvious. What you gain beyond the immediate price difference is a genuinely capable, modern operating system. Ubuntu and Fedora, the 2 most common Linux options Lenovo ships, are both mature, well-supported, actively developed distributions with huge communities behind them. Everyday tasks like web browsing, email, video calls, document editing through LibreOffice or web-based Office alternatives, and media playback all work smoothly and reliably on modern Linux distributions in 2026, in a way that genuinely wasn't as polished even 5 or 6 years ago. For a huge number of people whose actual daily computer use is dominated by a web browser and a handful of common productivity tools, the practical difference in day-to-day experience is far smaller than most people assume before actually trying it. What you give up, and this is the honest part that any responsible breakdown of this story needs to include, is compatibility with specific pieces of Windows-only software that don't have a solid Linux equivalent. Certain specialized industry software, some CAD programs, certain proprietary business applications, some PC gaming titles despite huge improvements in Linux gaming compatibility through tools like Proton, either doesn't run on Linux at all or runs with enough friction that it's not a smooth drop-in replacement for the average user. If your job or your daily life depends on one of those specific programs, that's a real practical consideration that $140 in savings doesn't automatically outweigh. This isn't a story about Linux being strictly better than Windows in every case. It's a story about a real measurable price difference existing for a choice that, for a meaningful chunk of buyers, is now genuinely worth considering rather than dismissing outright. It's worth walking through a few concrete examples of where this line actually falls, because vague talk about some software not working isn't especially useful without specifics. If you're a professional video editor relying specifically on Adobe Premiere Pro, that software has no native Linux version, and running it through a compatibility layer is not something most professionals would consider reliable enough for paid client work. If you're a gamer with a large existing Steam library, the picture is actually much better than most people assume. Valve's Proton compatibility layer has made a genuinely enormous percentage of the Steam catalog playable on Linux with performance close to native Windows in many cases, though certain titles with aggressive anti-cheat systems still refuse to run at all. If you're someone whose computer use is mostly web browsing, email, streaming video, video calls, and general document work, you'll likely notice remarkably little difference day to day because virtually all of that now happens inside a browser, regardless of which operating system is running underneath it. That last category, frankly, describes an enormous share of everyday computer users, probably a much larger share than most people would guess before actually sitting down and cataloging what they really use their laptop for on a typical day. Let's also talk briefly about the elephant in the room this kind of story always raises. Does Microsoft actually care about this? Here's where I want to be careful to separate what we actually know from what we're reasonably inferring. Microsoft has not issued any kind of public statement specifically responding to Lenovo's Linux pricing structure. There's no press release, no executive quote, no official acknowledgement that this is even something Microsoft is tracking closely as a competitive threat. So let's be clear about what we're actually working with here. We're inferring likely internal significance based on what we know about Microsoft's business incentives, not reporting a confirmed reaction. That said, the incentive structure here is worth walking through because it does tell a real story even without a direct quote from Redmond. Windows OEM licensing revenue, the money Microsoft collects from PC manufacturers like Lenovo for every Windows license bundled into a machine, has historically been an enormous, extremely reliable revenue stream for Microsoft, generated essentially passively every single time somebody buys a new Windows PC anywhere in the world. It doesn't require Microsoft to build a new feature, run a marketing campaign, or do much of anything beyond maintaining the existing licensing relationship. Every laptop sold with Windows pre-installed is, in effect, a small automatic royalty payment flowing back to Microsoft. This matters even more when you consider how Microsoft's own business has been shifting in recent years. A growing share of Microsoft's overall revenue now comes from cloud services, subscriptions, and enterprise software rather than from Windows licensing specifically. Azure, Microsoft 365 subscriptions, and a range of other recurring revenue products have become increasingly central to the company's financial story. But that shift doesn't mean Windows OEM licensing has become unimportant. It's still a substantial, high-margin, low-effort revenue stream sitting underneath everything else Microsoft does, and high-margin recurring revenue streams are exactly the kind of thing a company defends carefully, even while its growth story is being told elsewhere. When the world's largest PC manufacturer makes it easy, visible, and financially attractive for a meaningful slice of its customer base to opt out of that arrangement, that represents genuine, measurable pressure on a revenue stream Microsoft has relied on for decades. It doesn't need to be a huge percentage of Lenovo's total unit sales to matter. Even a modest shift in consumer and enterprise purchasing behavior, multiplied across a company selling tens of millions of units a year, adds up to real numbers on a spreadsheet somewhere inside Microsoft's finance division. And this pricing gap doesn't exist in isolation. It's landing at a moment when several other pressures are already stacking up against Windows' default dominance simultaneously, none of which, on their own, would be enough to shift anything meaningfully, but which together paint a genuinely different picture than the one most people still carry around in their heads about Windows' unquestioned place on the desktop. Windows 10's end of support pushed a wave of users to reconsider their next step, rather than simply defaulting to whatever came next from Microsoft. Windows 11's hardware requirements, TPM 2.0, Secure Boot, locked out a meaningful population of otherwise perfectly functional older machines, creating exactly the kind of friction that makes people stop and actually consider alternatives for the first time in years. Concerns about Windows 11's expanding data collection and increasingly aggressive integration of AI features have generated real, documented consumer backlash. And on top of all of that, governments across Europe have been actively reconsidering their reliance on Microsoft specifically, for reasons tied to cost and digital sovereignty, a separate but related thread involving countries moving meaningful chunks of their public sector infrastructure away from Microsoft products entirely. None of these pressures individually would be enough to meaningfully dent Windows' dominant market position, but stacked together, with a visible price incentive from the world's biggest PC maker sitting right on top of it, they start to look less like isolated grumbling and more like a genuine, if still gradual, shift in the underlying default. I think it's worth being honest about the limits of this story too, because overselling it would undercut the actual real significance of what's happening. This is not Lenovo abandoning Windows. The overwhelming majority of Lenovo's laptop sales still ship with Windows pre-installed, and that's not changing anytime soon. Windows remains the default, the path of least resistance, the option most consumers will simply accept without a second thought, the same way they always have. What's changed isn't the default. What's changed is that for the first time at this kind of visible mainstream scale, there's a clearly priced alternative sitting right next to it on the exact same product page for anyone willing to look. It's worth being honest that this option isn't available across Lenovo's entire catalog, and pretending otherwise would set the wrong expectation for anyone about to go shopping based on this video. Not every ThinkPad, Yoga, Legion, or LOQ model offers a Linux configuration at checkout. Coverage varies significantly by product line and by region, and buyers specifically interested in this option need to actively filter for it on Lenovo's website rather than assuming it'll show up automatically on whatever model they were already considering. That's an important practical caveat for anyone watching this and thinking about actually shopping for one of these machines. Don't assume the savings are sitting there on every single Lenovo product. Go check the specific model you're interested in. There's also a broader pattern worth naming here, one that connects to other stories we've covered on this channel. Time and again, we've seen that meaningful shifts away from Microsoft's default dominance don't tend to arrive as dramatic, singular events. A lawsuit, a scandal, a rival product launch that changes everything overnight. They tend to arrive quietly, structurally, through decisions like this one, a pricing option sitting on a configuration page for 6 years before anyone really noticed it, a certificate transition that breaks dual boot systems without much warning, a government deciding a licensing renewal isn't worth the cost anymore. None of these individually topples anything, but collectively, over years, they describe the shape of a slow erosion in a default that used to feel completely unshakable. So let's bring this back to the actual number sitting in this video's title, because I think it deserves one more direct look before we close out. $140. That's the gap on a single ThinkPad X1 Carbon configuration sitting there right now on Lenovo's own website, available to anyone who clicks the right drop-down menu. It's not a rumor, it's not a leaked internal memo, it's not a limited time promotional stunt. It's a standing 6-year-old configuration option that most people simply never noticed, because nobody ever pointed a spotlight directly at it before. It's worth sitting with just how unusual that kind of price transparency actually is in the broader technology industry. Most companies, across most product categories, work hard to avoid ever letting customers directly compare the cost of a bundled component against its absence. You rarely see a car dealership breaking out exactly what a specific trim package costs against an identical model without it, sitting on the same page, in a way that invites a direct side-by-side comparison. Software bundling in particular has historically been one of the most opaque parts of the entire PC industry, which is exactly why the Windows tax concept existed mostly as an insider's talking point among enthusiasts and industry. Analysts for years, rather than something an ordinary shopper could point to and verify for themselves with 2 clicks. Lenovo's configuration page, whether intentionally or not, handed regular consumers exactly that kind of verification tool. Here's the question I actually want to leave you with, because I think it's more useful than just restating the number one more time. If $140 of genuine, visible savings is enough to make a meaningful number of buyers stop and seriously consider Linux for the first time, people who would otherwise have never questioned the default sitting in front of them, what does that actually tell us about how much of Windows' historical dominance on the desktop has really been about people actively preferring it, versus how much of it has simply been about nobody ever showing them a clearly priced alternative sitting right next to it? I want to know where you land on this. If you were shopping for a new laptop today and saw that exact price gap sitting on the checkout page, Windows on one side, Linux and $100+ back in your pocket on the other, which way would you actually go and why? Tell me in the comments, because I think the honest answer probably depends a lot on what you actually use a computer for day to day. And I genuinely like to hear the real reasoning from people across that whole spectrum, not just the Linux enthusiasts who will obviously say Linux. And if you're someone who's never actually checked whether your favorite laptop offers this option, that's genuinely worth 5 minutes of your time before your next purchase. Pull up Lenovo's website, find the model you're actually considering, and look for an operating system filter in the configuration options. You might find nothing. Plenty of models simply don't offer it. But you might also find exactly the kind of gap we've spent this whole video walking through, sitting there quietly, waiting for someone to actually notice it. If you want more coverage of these quieter shifts in the Windows versus Linux landscape, the ones that don't come with a splashy press release, but that add up to something genuinely significant when you look closely enough, subscribe, hit the bell so you don't miss the next one, and I will see you in the next video, where we'll keep digging into the numbers other channels skip past,